Yeah, and that's, that's something about reading people who were right in different times. Right? Obviously, it's going to be a lot easier to understand, and you just don't have to wrestle with it as much. Writers from our time, right, who are speaking in a way that is much more familiar to us. Also take into consideration, like in some cases, a lot of the philosophers, their work is like being translated, right, from other languages. So these super complex ideas. Yeah, good. I see some other questions about paper topics. So Ava, can I do a paper on religious psychosis? That would be amazing. Just make sure it's a philosophical approach, right? So we're going to, right, whether or not, whether or not religious experiences count as psychosis, or, something like this. So again, we're going to be coming up with definitions of what we mean by these things. Was there a specific angle you were thinking of, Ava? Love it. After this, everyone's going to change their topics, right? Okay, well, if any of you have any more questions about your topics, please don't hesitate to reach out. What makes religious belief differ from? Oh, yeah, excellent question. Yeah, good. So whether or not they're the same, whether or not they're different, whether or not some particular characteristic makes them different. Yeah, good. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Any other questions about possible paper topics or questions about the paper itself? Okay. Well, speaking of psychology, then, I'm going to use that as a segue to the question that I left you all with on Tuesday. So, Tuesday, we introduced the philosophical problem of evil. We've mentioned it a lot already in this class because we've talked about God's attributes. And so, we did a little bit of review of that, but we really dived into the problem. We talked about two different versions of the problem. We defined what we mean by evil, right? We distinguish between different types of evils. Okay, so I want to do a quick review of that before we dive into what is a psychology question. I mentioned that David Hume has a very interesting cognitive psychological observation about people who deny the amount of evil in the world, right? So one of the primary cruxes, again, of this problem is not just that there is evil, right? Because again, we're going to be also looking at responses to the problem known as theodicies. And these theodicies are going to probably explain why an all good, all powerful, all knowing God would allow some evil, right? That seems somewhat reasonable. Again, most of us can understand some sort of utilitarian, ends justify the means business. But then we have to ask ourselves again, why so much evil, right? And so there is a question about whether or not we agree about how much evil there is in the world. Okay, so I'm going to start off with Hume, but before we get into that, questions about our introduction to the problem of evil. And if there are no questions, that means I'm going to ask you questions. So, like, what are the two different versions of the problem? The two different versions of the problem of evil. All right, do you remember anything about the two different versions of the problem? Or do you remember anything from Tuesday? Anything? Make it super easy for you. Good. And do you remember what we meant by evil? What's the definition of evil we're using in philosophy? Yeah, harm, suffering, right? So the experience of harm. Yes, right? So specifically, right, to avoid any, questions about, are we metaphysically committed to the devil, right, or demon, like, so avoiding all those other potential entities of evil, jinn, if we're looking at Islamic theology, right? So all it could be spirits in certain other religions, right? Setting aside any other supernatural entities that might be responsible for evil, we're just understanding evil for the problem of evil as suffering. But of course, there are different types of evils, different types of sufferings. David, do you remember? Or is that a question? Exactly. Right. And so the reason why we want to know exactly what evil is and exactly what types of evil we're concerned with is because not just for the problem, but specifically for the Theodicies, the responses. When someone is going to try to explain why this particular conception of God, right, with those three attributes that make up the problem, why this kind of God would allow this particular type of evil. And so most Theodicies are going to explain which type of evil, moral or natural. We looked at some of the main types of, yeah, that's right, David. They're going to focus on explaining away moral evils. Okay, so most of the Theodicies, again, there are many different types. They fall into one of mainly three types of categories, right? But they mostly explain away moral evils. Now, if someone is going to explain away moral evil, could they also explain away natural evil with the same explanation? Remember how we talked about how some people could conceive of natural evils as moral evils? How could a natural disaster be an instance of moral evil rather than natural evil? Absolutely, right? So one way you could lump natural evils in with moral evils is by attributing it to something like human or man-made, right? Human exacerbated climate change, right? So the idea is that, okay, yes, we always have tsunamis or storms or whatever, but they're so much worse and there's just so much more suffering because of human activity, right? Post-industrial revolution. What's another way you could lump all natural evils in? Right, so something about original sin, humans being deserving of, right? This sort of retribution. It doesn't even have to be original sin. It could just be any sort of sin, right? Even if it's not the original one, if you've sinned in other ways, right? There are plenty of ways to sin. Plenty of ways to violate moral codes in religious traditions, right? And so someone could just say, this is what God does, right? This is the punishment for your actions, right? It might manifest as a natural disaster, but it is a direct result of the will of God, right? In response to something we've done. So again, I shared with you some a rather silly recent example, but of course you can also, we've talked about other ancient examples in the past, right? Like when we were talking about miracles, we talked about people misinterpreting, right, a solar eclipse as a sign from God, right? So even natural disasters, right, can be interpreted as punishment or reward. And again, we see this in probably the classic example in the West would be Noah's Ark, right? And the flooding of the world, right? As punishment. And then the survivors are the ones who are rewarded, right? So even natural disasters could be viewed, right, as a direct result of human action. So the idea is, again, a successful theodicy, a successful story of why God would allow these evils will account for as many types of evil as possible, right? The fewer types of evil the theodicy accounts for, the less successful it's going to be, right? Because we're going to want to understand why God would allow all these different types. Okay, so who can tell us, again, the two different versions of the problem? Okay, and so this has to do with its logical structure. So there's a deductive version and there's an inductive version of the problem of evil. Who can remind us what the difference is? You can call on some more people. Jackson? Deductive version of the problem of evil and the inductive version. And this is really just about the difference between deduction and induction, if you can remember that from the beginning of the quarter. Thought you unmute yourself? Exactly right. Okay, so the difference between deductive arguments and inductive arguments, again, are what type of support they provide for the conclusion. So the deductive version of the problem of evil, you're exactly right, is going to try to prove beyond a doubt that this type of God does not exist, right? Whereas the inductive version is just going to say it's very unlikely that this type of God exists. Okay. And so again, this type of God being one that has those three attributes: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, right? Has to be all three. If we lose any one of them, right, the problem goes away. Okay, so who can remember which of the three attributes is the easiest to give up when we're talking about a monotheistic God? One, for monotheistic religious traditions to give up is the notion of omnibenevolence. And the classic example of this is in Zoroastrianism, right? But we're even going to see some versions of this in the Abrahamic religions, right? As these philosophers, these theologians try to give us their theodicies, explain why God would allow this, we really see that, even an all good being allows evil. So we're sort of changing what we mean by all good here, right? An all good being is not just a being that only makes good things happen. So really diving into what that omnibenevolence entails, and maybe it's not all good. Other questions about the difference between these two versions? And again, it's an important distinction, right? Because one is trying to argue that something does not exist. And as we've previously sort of discussed, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to prove that something doesn't exist, right? So that is what the deductive argument is trying to do. The inductive version is not trying to do that at all, right? Just simply trying to say that it's very unlikely that this type of God exists. All right, so then other last quick review before we dive into Hume. What were the three main types of theodicies or responses that we're going to see to the problem of evil? So these are the stories that monotheists will give us to explain why a God with all three of these attributes would allow evil to occur. Again, they fall into one of three varieties. Catherine, been reliable. Excellent. Free will theodicies, yes, right? Which we've already sort of brought up in conversation, right? One possible response to the problem of evil is to say, look, God willed that we have freedom of choice, right? That we be able to exercise our autonomy and make our own decisions. So God would they would contradict themselves, right? If they intervened every time we tried to exercise our free will in a way that would result in evil or suffering, right? So the idea is that God cannot both give us free will and intervene in our evil choices, right? But again, that only presumes moral evil, right? So again, depends on what you think about natural evils. But yes, free will, absolutely, right? That's a big one. What other types? Alondra, do you remember any from Tuesday? Were you here for that portion? Okay, what about divine reward? Do you remember anything about that? Part of it, but how does that justify the suffering we experience? And specifically, the more worthy we become, right? So these types of theodicies are called soul-making theodicies, right? Like you have to make your soul worthy of that divine reward, right? So heaven is not just something that we get, right? It's something we have to earn. And so facing evils in this life is how we make our souls worthy. Okay, and then the last one, this is the Leibniz one. I mentioned it in the context of Voltaire and the story Candide. I remember. This is probably the explanation you hear the most often from people who believe, like people that you've met. What do people most often say when they experience some great evil or suffering? How do they experience? Yes, a greater kind of thing. Yes, greater kind of plan, greater kind of design. In other words, this is called the best of all possible worlds, right? And so the idea is that there is some bigger picture here, right? That God's omniscience would have given them access to, right? We are not infinitely intelligent, okay? So we are incapable of comprehending. And so that best of all possible worlds, Theodicy is trying to give us an argument for why we should think this is the best of all possible worlds. It's a really interesting argument. We'll get into it, but we're going to start off with Hume now. Okay, so any more questions about review before we dive into Hume? All right, so we're starting off with a psychological observation I said he made, and this is on slide 21 for those of you following along. And so this is a claim, right, an observation, right? So Hume is an empiricist, right, that radical type of empiricism. And he makes the observation that there is more evil in the world than good. Okay, so this is a big part of the problem of evil for him. Not just that there is evil, but that there's more evil in the world than good. So my question to you all is, do you agree with him? Why or why not? You make me call on you one by one?
I don't agree.
Thank you, Abel. Yes, Gavin, I can. The question is, do you agree with David Hume when he observes of the world that there is more evil than good? So, Ava, you said you do not agree with him.
I do not.
And do you mind sharing why not? Good. So there's some things that actually that you're saying here that Hume is going to agree with. So he's going to agree with you that the impact of evil is greater than the impact of good. And that's actually going to be part of why he thinks there's more of it, right? Because its impact is larger and perhaps even lasts longer. Um, the other elements of seeing it more, that's really interesting. That's maybe something, definitely of our time that like Hume didn't have, the 24-hour news cycle and, dealing with the fact that algorithms, like apparently viewership is driven more by things we dislike than things we like. So the algorithms are actually programmed to put up more of the bad stuff, right? Because it elicits stronger emotions from us. Right? It's why like some comedians had to go out of their way to create like happy day news and things, right? Like just normal media does not cater to the good things. We watch things that highlight the evil. There's some psychological reason for that. Hume thinks there is. And that's actually going to be the basis for why he thinks there's more evil than good in the world, and he thinks it has to do with our psychology. But I want to give other people to have a chance to chime in before I say more. So, other thoughts on whether we agree or not with Hume. Good. And so this is tapping into that psychological observation I was mentioning that Hume made. So he thinks that for this core reason, and I think the job interview example is a great example of this, right? So he thinks that one of the primary reasons that there's more evil in the world than good is that we are always waiting for other people to hurt us, right? We're constantly anticipating. It's a survival tactic, right? It's what's helped us to survive, to be vigilant, right? To be aware of our surroundings and of potential threats. But we are constantly waiting for other people to do something bad to us. And if they're not doing it, then we are doing it to ourselves, right? In all of those insecurities, right? All of the ways in which we undercut ourselves. And so he thinks that this is, unfortunately, he doesn't explain why necessarily, but he thinks that this is a feature of human psychology that we do this to ourselves. And so even when we're not actually experiencing suffering in the world, we are imagining when the suffering is going to happen, and we're anticipating the suffering and things like this, right? And so it's even, I think, present in maybe we call them bittersweet moments, right? Have any of you ever experienced like a moment that is just so joyful and beautiful, but there's almost something bitter about it because you're like, oh, this is not forever, or like, oh, I wish I got to do this more often. Like you immediately go to the negatives, right? Like your mind immediately starts going to, right, all of the reasons why this doesn't get to happen more, or so on and so forth. Yeah, Ava, absolutely, that's a great insight, right? Because we absolutely set the stage, right? With our expectations, we manifest those in our behaviors, right? It's often why people will say the opposite too: fake it till you make it, right? If you just put forth that energy of confidence and right, a lot of people will believe it. They'll believe what they see. But yeah, the idea is that we have a harder time emphasizing the good. And yeah, for whatever reason that might be, Hume is going to say it's because there's been more evil in the world than good. Okay, so again, right, to be clear, there are a few options that we have, right? We could say that there's an equal amount of good and evil, right? That they're exactly codependent, mutually dependent, right? You could say that there's the opposite of what Hume said, right? That there's more good in the world than evil. Anyone want to make that argument? That there's more good in the world? Or at best, are they equal? Yeah, so there are like three options, right? Is there
Okay.
more evil in the world?
Um,
Is there more good in the world? Or are they sort of equal? Yeah, this is tough, right? Because I think we're all sort of touching on here this insight. And I think modern psychology has lended a lot to that, which is that, any situation, you can probably sort of reframe it, right? That's pretty much what therapists help people do, right? Is you deal with trauma not by pretending it didn't happen or right, trying to explain it away, but reframing our understanding of it. And so one could argue, and unfortunately, this has been weaponized a lot against people who have experienced trauma, is to say, well, oh, that's not really evil. You just have to right? You just have to think of it differently. You just have to learn to think of it differently. So we don't want to dismiss the evil, but there is something about the perspective we take of it, right? So again, if any of you are, yeah, if whether it's an interpersonal relationship, Gavin, like you were hinting at, right? Like, you have to learn from experience who to trust, who to give that respect to. Maybe you start with one approach and you realize through trial and error that that's maybe not the best approach, right? Or you realize that, even if it doesn't always work, there's still on the whole, right? This is a good rule of thumb to use, right? So again, that sort of stuff is very much dependent, like you said, on context, on our specific experiences. So things to consider, right? How do you view the suffering in the world? Is it evil? Is it something that we just have to reframe and re-understand in a different light? Right? Again, we don't want to dismiss the suffering, the genuine suffering that occurs, because then if we explain it all away, then it's just all good, right? If everything is just part of God's plan and God's plan is always perfect, then there is no evil or suffering in the world, right? But we seem to be of the opinion that there is suffering and that there are at least some types of evil, right? And so we don't want to explain all of them away, but we want to account for the fact that we can view them differently, especially over time, right? Things that were evil need not stay evil perhaps forever. Okay, so the question then is, could God have done things differently, right? However you think the world is made up now, right? Whether you think it's the same amount of good of evil or if you think one outweighs the other, the question then is, could it have been otherwise? Could God have created a different world, right? And unfortunately, I have only one fiction example of this, and it's old, and you guys probably won't even know it. It's the original version of the show Charmed, not the remake. And there is an episode where they basically, some demon or something, like gets rid of all the evil in the world, right? But what they realize that means is that every time someone chooses, right, here's the free will for you, David, right? Every time someone chooses to do something evil, they just pop out of existence, right? That's the new rule. That's how they maintain, you remember that episode? Yay! I'm not totally out of date. Okay. Right. I think this is like a great example of what a theodicy might be trying to get at, right? When they say that even this type of world is the best one, because we have to allow some types of evil, right, in order to allow for goodness, right? The goodness of things like free will and a choice and things like that. Ava. So then the question is, would that world be better than this one?
Equal.
Well, so if it's potentially better, then that is a threat to the last type of theodicy, right? The theodicy that this is the best of all possible worlds. If we can imagine a better world, right, then God has failed to create the best possible world, which is,
and I think that's on him.
And that's on it. Yeah, exactly. That's ultimately, right, a threat to their existence, their attributes, right? Maybe they're not perfect, right? Maybe it's something more like deism, right? All of the things we've talked about before, right? But we have to ask ourselves, what is the best possible arrangement of good and evil, right? And is the world that we're in matching up to that idea? Okay. All right. So the next part I want to get to, just because we are running out of time, is what Hume says to someone who denies the amount of evil in the world, right? So this is someone who either thinks that there's the same amount, but he's really focusing on people who think that there's more good in the world than evil. Okay. And he says, according to Hume, if you think there is more good in the world than evil, then one of two things is happening. One, he thinks you might be in denial about how much evil there is in the world. or, and this might be the more generous one, you've just been very lucky not to have experienced, right, the amount of suffering. So the second one is maybe like an element of privilege. Okay. So either, if you disagree with him, he thinks either you're in denial or you've just been especially fortunate and you haven't had to suffer the many ills that most people suffer in the world. Okay. So again, why is he saying this? Right? He's saying we are not, of course, denying, right, that others suffer, But we need to be able to observe, right, this habit that we often have. And Ava, this is, I think, goes to something you said, right, about the effects of good and bad. So while we all seem to be in agreement, and sorry, Gavin had to leave because he was joining in this as well, but we talked about the idea that, right, that the effects of evil things last longer, right? But there's one exception to that, and that is in memory. Like actual live memory, not like physical trauma, body memory stuff, but your actual cognitive memory. We tend to remember things a lot more positively than they actually were, right? We whitewash and whatever pink wash, rosy colored wash our memories a lot, and that's potentially a defense mechanism, right? That we have developed over time. But in that sense, right, he might think that sometimes we might not even trust our own memories of the past, right? Like, have you ever had to be reminded about how bad a relationship was with someone because you only are remembering the good parts, right? That's a stereotype for a reason. Yeah, Ava. Philosopher, take everyone
Yeah.
with a grain of salt. Yes. No, but this is a good point. Right. So just as we were saying, it's context dependent, right? Even to our approach to negative, positive experiences and what our patterns of reaction are going to be to them. So there was a really interesting study done on people who experienced great loss and great gain in their life. So they did a study of people who won the lottery and people who became paraplegics later in life, right? Who lost all of their, at least from the waist down, I think. And what they found in the study was really interesting, which was basically what you're saying, Ava, which is the people who had an inclination to more positive thinking, even if they experienced a significant period of depression after becoming paraplegic, right? They would eventually peter out towards their optimism again. Whereas people who lent or had more tendencies towards depression, right, prior to the big change in their life, even if they won the lottery after they experienced that high, right, they too would dip down back into their regular depression, right? So everyone sort of petered out after the big change, after they adjusted to the big change in their life. They all just sort of went back to being their general positive or negative selves, right, after the fact. So maybe it's not even, right, maybe it's a little bit more predetermined in our look too. But again, what does God have to say about that then? Right? Why some of us are predisposed in some ways than another. Good, good. Okay. So then again, the other thing is that, right, even if we're not causing actual pain to one another, again, Hume also thinks that we have a lot of anxieties and fears that will cause us to create that harm or that suffering in ourselves. Okay. Other things that he's also said that he talks about that we've just touched on, pain is more potent than pleasure, right? He thinks the effects of it are stronger and that they last longer. He also thinks that the longer pleasure occurs, the more it will dwindle, right? So, like, if you have something that causes you great pleasure, the longer you have it, the less pleasure you'll get over a period of time. Whereas if you're enduring something that is causing you pain or suffering, the longer you experience that thing, the more pain, right? It's got an increase. It accumulates over time. It's a cumulative increase. Whereas pleasure is the opposite, right? So for these various reasons, these associations, right, he thinks that there is more pain and suffering in the world than there is pleasure, right? And that is reason to disregard, right, such a God. Okay, so I do want to get into Leibniz's possible worlds, and then we're not even going to get into Plantinga's free will defense. Oh, there's so much to talk about. Okay, but definitely look through the slides, right, very carefully. And then if we do have lingering questions next week, we can talk about it then as well, because this is a very robust conversation, right? But going back to this idea of, is there more good than evil? Is there a same amount, right? What sort of world is there? And this is on slide 37, right? Leibniz is setting up, right, an argument for why we should think that of all the possibilities God had, right, when creating the universe, why should we think that this is the best one? So before God created the universe, God was confronted with a wide array of options in terms of possible worlds that they could have created, right? That's just plausible, right? God could have created the world differently, and there's gotta be a large array of possibilities that God could have chosen from. And if it's the kind of God that we're talking about, right, then God would have created the best of all possible worlds. And God created this world, right? So the idea is that given the features of God, God could not have failed to have created the best of all possible worlds. And since this is the world that God created, this must be the best, right? So by its very existence, and this kind of goes back to the ontological argument, right? So do you remember we talked about the difference between existing in the mind and existing in reality? Which one's better, right? This is the world that actually exists, whereas all the other possible worlds just exist in our mind. So they're not as good, right? This is the best of all possible worlds because it's the one that actually exists. So take a look at that argument, right? See what you think about it. Okay. And then think about what you think about Leibniz's response, which is that if God had created a different possible world, that those would have been less perfect than ours. And again, here he rests on something like the free will theodicy. He thinks that any of those other possibilities where there was more goodness in the world than evil, we would have had to sacrifice our free will. So just know that in his best of all possible worlds theodicy, he is using a little bit of the free will theodicy, right? To justify why not only is this the best of all possible worlds because it's the one that actually exists, but it's better than the other possibilities because those would have probably necessitated us giving up our free will. That is an extension of this, right? So you could think not only is this the best of all possible worlds, but it's part of a grand design that, again, we're not capable of comprehending. Right. So things are like we're just witnessing this small moment, this small piece of this tiny, whatever, but the puzzle is enormous and we can't possibly comprehend it. Again, this will all depend on how intellectually satisfied you are by that, right? For those who are not intellectually satisfied by that, they will continue to search. There you go. David, I wanted to give you another chance to chime in before class ends. No, it is incomplete, but only because then we need to establish then what the function of the universe is, right? And do we serve a purpose in it? Because as you are probably aware, most of the monotheistic religions are also very anthropocentric, very human-centered, right? And so creations, right? So if we're the best, then why hasn't God created a universe that's ripe for our development, right, in the ways that you were talking about? Right? By filling in that picture, you are creating a metaphysical model, right, of what you think reality is like. And the idea is that all those pieces that you add need to be consistent with each other, right? They need to make the whole thing fit together. Yeah, and so that's exactly what we're looking at. And that's a perfect segue into next week because we will be starting Death and the Afterlife and the Soul. All right, so please make sure to take a look at the PowerPoint from this week because we did not get through even half of it. So I will leave some time on Tuesday for us to answer more questions about that. But if you need to get going, have a wonderful weekend. I'll hang out for a minute for